Good morning, everyone. My name's Gary Nunn, and I'm just delighted to be with you for your worship service this morning. It's a great privilege, and thank you so much for allowing me to present what frankly is some troubling material about a scourge in our society that is going on not only in the world and the U.S., but also, unfortunately, locally here in the Orlando area. And I've been asked to come out and speak to you about human trafficking. And the definition of that is the exploitation of vulnerable people by means of fraud, force, or coercion for purposes of commercial sex and involuntary labor. Now, given the unspeakable nature of things that happen to the victims of this, let's begin with a brief overview that's not so reliant on words to get its message across. Oh, thank you, Christian. And thank you for your attention. You know, one of the big people that are organizations is the Christian community in Orlando that's fighting this scourge. I happen to come from the Catholic faith, but all across the denomination here in Orlando, we're blessed with churches that are really on the front lines of fighting against the type of problems that we've just seen referenced. So I thought it might be appropriate to start our discussion presentation this morning with a prayer to end human trafficking. So if you might pray with me. Oh God, our words cannot express what our minds can barely comprehend and our hearts feel when we hear of children and youth being deceived and transported to unknown places for purposes of sexual and labor exploitation because of human greed and profit. Our hearts are saddened and our spirits are angry that the dignity and rights of those who are trafficked are violated by threats, deception, and force. We cry out as a group against the degrading practice of trafficking and pray for its end. Please, Lord, give us the wisdom and courage to stand in solidarity with our children and youth, that together we can find ways to the freedom that is your gift to all of us. We ask this through Jesus Christ in union with God, our Creator, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Thank you. And so this morning, I've got basically a slide, a PowerPoint presentation I want to go through to give everyone a sense of the issues. And a lot of it is big picture. You'll see about the problem on a worldwide basis. But I've tried to build in some information about what's going on locally here in Greater Orlando, because it's all of our backyards, and that's what they say: think globally, act locally. And so I'll do that, and I'm going to kind of try to high step it, as it were, through some of the slides. So in order to focus on, we have some audio-visual links that are victims. You'll see there's a terminology in human trafficking, and those who are being oppressed, and a lot of them, frankly, are young folks. As you'll see here, human trafficking on the sex side of the scale kind of starts around age 11, the threat, and goes well into the teens, even though older people are involved in that as well. But it's a young person's threat. So we'll see that, and for any of those who find any of the information too distressing, please know that on the back table here of the sacristy, I've got about a half dozen worksheets that you can take, and it kind of gives information that would be of help to you. Even though, as I said, some of this information is distressing, I didn't want to leave you this morning, with a degree of everything's terrible and we can't do anything about it, and feeling bad. We all do need to be concerned, but we want to talk, and I gather we'll have some opportunity for questions in a bit about things that you, either as concerned parents or as a congregation, might want to be involved in to move through this threat. And so a couple of facts you might not be familiar with, most people aren't. Human trafficking is the #2 crime worldwide behind drugs, and there's estimated to be over 40 million victims worldwide, and 1/4 of those are unfortunately children. And the average age that beginning at which it afflicts girls is age 11, actually. And the state of Florida is one of the top 3 states, or I guess you could more properly say bottom 3 states in terms of prevalence of trafficking. California and Texas are the only place that's larger. And here in Orlando, we are the number 3 city in the whole country for calls that go in to, there's a human trafficking hotline. And if you take nothing else from my presentation this morning, then where could I go to get help? At the very back, we've got this brochure, Human Trafficking Task Force, that my church puts out. And on the back, you've got phone numbers. It's called Human Trafficking Hotline, where, certainly if there's immediate dangers, you call 911 for the police. But it's a much broader issue in terms of threats to our schools, to our communities, and this is a number in which they can get you in contact with people locally that would be of immediate assistance. Traffickers target 1 in every 3 middle school children, and the reality is traffickers oftentimes recruit children, teenagers, young adults to influence, to bring about to entice their peer group to become involved in the unspeakable things that are going on. And while trafficking also worldwide involves broader things such as the sale of the trade of body organs such as kidneys, primarily over in Asia, and the adoption of infants stolen from parents, this morning we wanted to focus on 2 things. One, the labor, but primarily, and I'm assuming as parents, you all would be most interested in the threats to young people on the sex trade side. So most of the information that will be conveyed will be on that. And Christian, let's go ahead and start, if we could please, the slide presentation, and we'll go right up to slide 3 and begin here. And so briefly, as I said, the exploitation of people, primarily the young, through force, fraud, and coercion, and there's a lot of mischaracterization of what trafficking is. On the back table here, you've got this little wallet-sized card that's put out by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and it tells about the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. And most of our leaders that talk about this in connection with the migration issue in Washington really make it clear that they don't know the difference. Human smuggling is certainly a crime, but it's when refugees pay to be taken across the border. So it's a crime, and you've heard about build the wall, this and that. That's what's called human smuggling. Bad enough. But human trafficking does not require borders to be crossed. It's basically as we said, force, fraud, and coercion coming upon people, and it can go on, at your child's school, at whatever, or at the shopping mall. Unfortunately, there's a large amount of trafficking that actually comes from within extended family members, and it's always something people are shocked to hear, but this talks about it. So, Christian, why don't we watch the congregation watch this first link about overall human trafficking, please?
How do you fight the second largest criminal industry in the world? You start with the product, human beings. Human trafficking happens a variety of ways, and it results in a variety of enslaved people. Recruiting someone by force for the purpose of debt bondage is trafficking. Obtaining someone's work by fraud for the purpose of involuntary servitude is trafficking. Those who are trafficked can be found working on farms, in hotels, in restaurants, in homes as caregivers or housekeepers, as street peddlers, and being sold for sex. There are many ways it happens, but the result is the same. An estimated 30 million people are exploited for the gain of others. It's not fair. Human trafficking is a $150 billion global industry. But the groups that fight trafficking have less than 1/10 of that budget. It's not a fair fight. In fact, the only thing fair about human trafficking is that it can happen anywhere and at any time. It happens in all 50 states right here in America. It's truly an equal opportunity atrocity.
Thanks. So we'll have about a half dozen or so of those brief clips. Again, I think it's more impactful for you to hear about this from the law enforcement and the victims themselves to get the point across, and I'll kind of try to walk us through. So the next couple of slides we'll just go through briefly, please. And this one gets across the point that it's not just the trafficking is not just a legal crime that sends people, not often enough, but to jail, but it's also an affront to individual dignity. It impacts on our God-given rights and human dignity, God's natural law. And the next slide kind of gives an overview. In my faith tradition, Pope Francis has been a very large contributing factor in terms of trying to fight what's going on. When he was Archbishop in Buenos Aires, he actually saved, I think it was 80 victims, hid them out from the traffickers to get them off the streets and from the trade. And one of the things I wanted to get across is every year there's a big meeting in Vatican City. He lives in this dormitory, you might know, that instead of the big, palace sofa there, and it's called the Santa Marta Group for St. Martha. And they get 30 different religious denominations from all across the world in law enforcement. And every November, there's a meeting in which worldwide they try to marshal that. And I thought it was telling, and I'd share with you that the last time around, the Pope apologized. He had like 50 trafficking victims from Rome there, and he apologized personally for not praying sufficiently for victims. So that's one of the things I would ask you. There's a lot you can do to help offset this, and don't forget, please, the prayer part, because prayer is very impactful on this. And so our next slide, why is it done? It's a list of depravities that exist in our society in terms of for prostitution, particularly when children are involved. Pornography is another big thing. Some people are on TV are fond of saying it's a victimless crime. It's not, folks. It's connected to this recruitment of individuals, and it's a broader sense. And also on the labor side, all of us are consumers. In the U.S., we want to buy everything, this and that, and buy it cheaply. Well, oftentimes the cheap side of that is because of the slave labor that goes into things like notoriously the fishing industry in Thailand, where we get 90% of our shrimp in the United States is just plagued with people being physically kidnapped, is what it amounts to, and thrown on these boats, and they're lucky to get out alive. So there's things we can do as a consumer, but again, it's a broader deal. And the next slide we will just kind of briefly pass over. A lot of it is due to our society and the greed within that. So this next slide, please, is our next video on that from a group called Shared Hope International, and it kind of gives you a shot more on the sex trafficking side of it, and has some distressing commentary from former very famous football player Lawrence Taylor, and we'll hear about that right now, please.
In 2006, the U.S. Department of State asked Shared Hope International a simple question: what is driving the markets of sex trafficking? But we found a more insidious, pervasive force propelling the commercial sex industry forward and creating the market for sex trafficking. Demand. People who purchase sex acts with children intentionally or carelessly, and with little fear.
It's the world of prostitution. I mean, you never know what you're gonna get, and if it's gonna be a pretty girl, ugly girl.
But the truth is, it's not prostitution, because there is no such thing as a child prostitute. Here's why. There is a federal law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which states that any minor used in a commercial sex act is a victim of sex trafficking, and anyone buying or selling that child is engaging in the crime of sex trafficking. And this happens in America. A 2010 study conducted by the Shapiro Group measured demand for commercial sex with children in Georgia. It found that over 400,000 men in Georgia today have bought sex with a young female. And in any given 7,200 men will buy sex with a adolescent female in Georgia. 3 warnings were given to couples seeking to buy sex with a, quote, young female. 7% were undeterred, and in Georgia. What does this mean for the rest of our nation? We investigated cases that have been brought against buyers in the past 5 years. We wanted to see how many buyers are actually arrested for their crimes and what type of sentences they face.
If there's no demand, there actually will be no supply. If I put something on a shelf and no one is buying it, I'm going to take it off the shelf.
I'm not the cause of prostitution, and sometimes I make mistakes and I may go out there, but I didn't pick her up in no daggone playground. She wasn't at hiding behind a school bus or getting off a school bus. This is a working girl that came to my room. It's all clean. I don't have to worry about your feelings. I can't worry about, it's all clean. I'm not saying it's right. But God, I think it's the oldest profession in the world.
They want what they want, and they want to get gone. I don't think no man that have anything to do with prostitution care about any female.
I got into a car with the buyer, and a few minutes later the police pulled us over and they pulled me out the car. And the buyer, on his face, he thought I was the police, he had a confused look on his face. But then when I got pulled out the car, they were very rough on me, come with us, they read me my rights, but they told the buyer, hey, you need to get out of there.
The TVPA carries hefty penalties for buyers, but this is a federal law. What about the state laws? If a state does not have strong laws to prosecute buyers, buyers are lightly punished, if at all, and therefore undeterred. Michael Gilliland, the former Sunflower Farmers Market's CEO, was charged with felony child prostitution in Arizona after soliciting sex with a person he believed to be a teenager. He faced a sentence that ranged from probation to 18 months in prison. He was sentenced to only 30 days in prison. Gilliland is not alone. Lawrence Taylor, Hall of Fame linebacker for the New York Giants and guest commentator on ESPN, paid $300 for sex with a 16-year-old girl in a New York hotel room. Under the federal TVPA, Taylor could have been convicted of a felony with a sentence of 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. But in a New York State courtroom, he pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanors and was sentenced to just 6 years of probation, not a day in jail. And the victim, the 16-year-old girl, was left to rebuild her life without justice. Studies of men who buy sex in Boston and Chicago found that 80% of men would be deterred from purchasing sex if they had to serve jail time if caught. Almost 90% of the men in Boston said they would be deterred if they had to register as a sex offender as a consequence.
So when addressing the issue of demand, it becomes hard for us during the course of our investigations to identify the various buyers that are out there. Oftentimes they have very limited interaction with the individuals providing the services. The girls typically don't keep good records, and so during the course of our investigations it becomes increasingly more difficult to identify and prosecute them.
So few buyers being arrested for their trafficking crime, and how many of those are actually punished? As a nation, are we doing everything we can to protect our children? Are we enforcing our criminal laws against sex trafficking? Shared Hope International is investigating which states are letting buyers walk free and which states are demanding justice. Well,
a little different spin, as distressing as it is on that. Christian, let's skip over the next slide in the interest of saving some time for feedback here, and go to why do victims stay, please? And one of the things I told you I wanted to kind of bring this more from the everything terrible going on in the world to our backyard. I don't know how many of you saw, it was about 18 months ago or so in the Orlando papers and television that there was a death actually of a teenage girl in the Pine Hills area that was reported, and just to kind of show you what the threat is. This was a 14-year-old girl who, with her sister, were being raised by a single mother. I had kind of been introduced to them through St. Andrew's Parish there on Colonial. They didn't attend as such, but they used to go to Sunday school class with some of the St. Andrew's people. And they were approached by a woman at high school. The mother, as you can appreciate, was working around the clock just to keep food on the table, and it was kind of a latchkey thing where the children weren't being supervised, and they didn't have money to do things that other school kids did. So an older woman who's hanging around the local high school just kind of came out of the woodwork and enticed them. So you want to make some money, you can come and work for us cleaning motels over in West Colonial area. And the two sisters went, and of course it wasn't about cleaning. This woman was the front person for a group of 5 Central American men who were hanging around, and they were there to entrap young girls. And they basically, lied to her, and then they also would dope them up with Xanax and cold medicine and this and that. But in short order, they were prostituted to older men through what was called Backpage.com. That's now mercifully been taken out of existence by the law, but there are other internet sites that are comparable. And it's not like they were, gagged and bound day and night. This went on for maybe 7 or I think it was 8 days it was. But at night they would sleep at home, but they were threatened. And that's one of the things on the slide here, point 4. Threats to family and friends. You might say, why don't these victims run away, tell somebody, tell the police? And in short order, they are, threatened by, if you do this, we're going to, kill your family, your pets, whatever that's dear to them. So this went on, and the 14-year-old was drugged quite a bit and passed out. And they one night just more or less left her in the room, and after about 6 hours she wasn't awake, and they took her by the hospital and dumped her off at the a drive-through in the emergency, and she died. And it was great tragedy. And basically the FBI ended up being called in, and they caught the culprits, and I believe 3 of them are now in long jail terms. But a lot of times, it doesn't. The culprits are never caught. You might say, what? They're despicable men out there doing this, but CNN's been doing these specials every 4 or 5 months on the human trafficking trade, and they were showing in Atlanta, for example, some of the basically pimps is what they are that are running this trade, make like $30,000 a week. So you can see what where they talk about demand and supply, and it's a great problem for society. And the next slide, if we would, Christian. And in terms of who are the victims, well, it's kind of cuts across all of society. From you probably read just before the Super Bowl down in the Miami area of Florida. You had the owner of the New England Patriots went into a massage parlor and received illegal services, and they had a big roundup of like 200 people. So it kind of cuts across all levels on society. And the odd thing was the women that were there. They were brought over from China, but they were in debt to some gang back in China, and they were never allowed to leave. They had like hot plates. They had to cook their meals, and they slept in this place. And supposedly it was in a strip mall. It's was supposed to be a nail hair salon, but that's kind of one of the fronts. And not saying every such establishment is, but that has been notorious. And I'll not go through all the list here, but you get the fact. You've got the picture there in the bottom of maids. A lot of Eastern European women in recent years have been brought over to work in houses or to be nannies, they think. And once they get there, the people, their employers, don't let them leave. They take their visa and make them pay back the cost of being transported to the U.S. So that's where we get into. Look, there's in our country, there's basically issues with basic labor rights, but then that's crossing the line in terms of why we call it human trafficking or modern day slavery. And next. Slide, some of the products of trafficking. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but in the back, you've got this worksheet handout. It shows what country is using, children or using slave-type help, and it runs the gamut from, half the world's there. Cotton from Brazil, timber, bricks from Bolivia, Thailand, I told you, is notorious for using enslaved in the shrimp trade, some of the big list on the coffee makers. And if you wanted to get into that part of what I can do as a consumer, there is a website, slaveryfootprint.org, and you type that up and you put in the product you're looking to buy. It could be a car, refrigerator, whatever, and it'll tell you where the parts come from and how much of it is slave related. And there's not a lot, sometimes choices if everybody's got to eat and have certain things, but if you could just be more conscious of that, we think as a society we could help, exercise some less of a demand, and that hopefully would be a part of driving down the overall supply. And then for our slide, on annual worldwide, you can see that as a number of people actually labor, there are more people in the red on the pie chart than sexually exploited worldwide. But in terms of dollar amounts, the sexual exploitation is much higher than the forced labor. Slide, please, Christian. So locally. Here's kind of a busy chart, but it basically shows last year, so it's pretty up to date. This is victims reported that were children only, did not include adults. And but Florida-wide, it shows that 93% of the victims of human trafficking were commercial sex related, and 84% of that amount were women. And on the bottom, you've got basically bar charts that are broken down to our local counties, and our county of Orange on the left. The blue line is number of cases reported versus verified cases, and then those not substantiated means they were reported by the victim, but the police couldn't verify it, and then where evidence was lacking. But you can kind of get a sense as to what is happening there. So let's move forward back to again put the focus on the sex trafficking, and we're going to hear from a young woman by the name of Lacey about how the victims can often be invisible to us in our normal course of life.
Do you know Lacey? She was born in your town about 15 years ago. She lives in your neighborhood. She goes to your school. She's in your youth group. The day before her 13th birthday, a young boy known as a spotter approached Lacey in public. He invited her to her first party. That night would change Lacey's life forever. He continued to stalk Lacey, learning her routine and approaching her multiple times in public places. Lacey had no idea these encounters were intentional. She thought it was fate, so she agreed to get together with him.
Started thinking, he really did like me.
This dating period was used to gain Lacey's trust. Lacey continued to see her stalker, and he slowly began to manipulate her more and more.
He bought me a dress, and it was really special to me. It's like,
she had no idea that helping him meant he would rent her body out to lustful men of all ages, from all walks of life, night after night. But Lacey's boyfriend groomed and manipulated her. He changed her name, her clothing, the way she felt about herself. He forced her into doing horrible, unthinkable things.
It's a night of breaking. When she should be young, she is now a broken woman. It's a night of high.
She's in your church. She's in your school. She's in your neighborhood.
Hope again. Are there any years? Anyone at all?
Thanks. And then a couple more slides briefly. Who are the victims? These are generalizations, obviously, but it could be most anyone. And one of the big markets is children from foster care homes or runaways, and a surprising number, like upwards of a quarter and all, are actually young males, particularly in the largest cities, like New York in particular, than children. But wanted to show you one more victim type slide, because it's the top one. Next slide, please. How sex trafficking on children is done. I think a lot of people after my presentation get the idea that there's still a lot of kidnapping and cloak and dagger stuff. It's more sophisticated and in the modern society. And this film clip, it's from a movie that goes like half an hour or so, called Chosen, but we've boiled it down to about, I think, 4 minutes. And a young woman from Seattle, I believe, called Brianna, and it gives you a sense of how vulnerable young women are in terms of trying to improve their life and what time it leads through. So let's hear from Brianna, if we could.
When I was 18, I met some new friends. I didn't know it, but they had partnered with people who had stalked me for about a year. I had no idea, but I was just meeting these guys for the first time and they knew everything about me. He really was persistent with me. He wanted me to call him all the time and see what was happening all the time in my daily life. And this happened for about a week before I decided to go and hang out with him up in the Seattle area. We were hanging out for about 4 days and everything was all good and it was all fun, and he kept his promise that this is the life of the rich and famous. I really did feel like I was glamorous and beautiful. On the third day he said, let's go to Arizona for Christmas vacation. And so, being from Washington State, I thought that was a fantastic idea, get out of the rain. Well, I had to return my parents' car, and my friend Evan said that he would help me move out and return the car. When I showed up to Evan's apartment, he kept asking me all these questions, and I started realizing that he wasn't going to help me move out, that he was trying to convince me that these were bad guys.
Parents should be aware that the risk is there. You could live in suburbia, you could live in the city, you could live anywhere. The risk is there because the demand is there.
I was really just pushing away from everybody. Somebody saying that my new friends who are helping me out live out my dreams, that that's a bad person. And so I was really offended, and I told Evan, you know, I don't need your help. I'll figure this out on my own. Well, when I went to leave, his parents and my parents were there, and so he really ruined my trust for him. And I felt like he was destroying our friendship by practically snitching on me.
They feel a sense of allegiance and a sense of camaraderie with this person who has manipulated them into thinking that I'm everything you need. Your parents didn't care enough about you to prevent this from happening. They don't understand you. You know, you're having a tough time with bullies at school. You don't have that problem here. I take care of you. You have nice things. You're never hungry. You know, you just have to do this one thing for me.
About 30 minutes later, this woman walks into the room, and I had no idea who she was, but my mom said, "Congresswoman Smith?" And I thought, Congresswoman, what? And then she introduces herself as someone who is experienced in getting girls to recognize and get out of human trafficking situations. After I realized that this could lead down a very bad, scary path, I decided to be honest and open up with Linda, and they ended up finding out that that trip down to Arizona for Christmas vacation actually wasn't gonna be a vacation. It was my destiny that they had planned for me. That's where it really hit home. I never thought that people out there existed like that.
Keep a dialogue open with your kids about the risks. It encouraged them to understand that stranger danger is a real thing, not only when you're 5 years old, but when you're 15 years old.
If there's one thing from my story that you learn, I hope that you take it to a youth. Teach youth about sex trafficking so that they can save a kid's life, just like my friend saved mine.
Well, that's pretty compelling. Like I said, that's the most common shown. So you've now seen Chosen, it's called. Next slide, please. I said I wanted to give you a sense of hope, if you will, things you can do. There is help out there. I think we've kind of looked at the threat sufficiently, but in Orlando, we're blessed to be one of perhaps the most robust response in the entire United States. There's an organization called United Abolitionists, which has been around for about 12, 15 years. It's run by a gentleman by the name of Tomas Lares, and he's built up this big infrastructure. It's basically started through Christian churches banding together. And there's something called the Greater Orlando Human Trafficking Task Force that I'm going to leave this contact information with Asoye in terms of if there's some thing you want to be more involved with, either personally or as a congregation, know that there's a lot of support and airing of this out there. Every January, it's Human Trafficking Awareness Month. The last Saturday of every January, down at Calvary Church, down off I-4 and Parr Road exit, the big church you see on the side. That's where kind of the abolitionist group is headquartered, and they have a very big turnout. This past January was about 1,500 people in there. Huge auditorium, and they have speakers nationwide about various aspects of this. And in a further sense, there's also something called the Faith Alliance in Orlando, just of churches. The Northlands Church has been very big in that. So, basically, if you run across certainly your family or friends you're concerned about, or street panhandlers, for example, oftentimes collecting money behind the bushes. There's some guy that's trafficking them, having turn everything over. There's a broader group, and again, it's on this brochure I told you. The phone number, it's 888-373-7888, and toll-free number you can call. And starting last year in the state of Florida, there's a sign here that has to go up in airports, bus terminals, and restaurants and places where trafficking has taken place, and very prominent. That number's on there, or a text, and you call that number, and basically, if you just have concerns and want to talk about that, they'll listen to you, and they'll bring it back locally. And the police department, the Florida Bureau of Investigation, they kind of then coordinate. And heaven forbid if one of your family members or friends has been trafficked, it's not something that you can just, people can be expected just to flow back into society or school. Oftentimes there's a great, sometimes there are drug problems involved, because that's the way they entice, victims to get them on drugs, and sometimes it's more psychological. But there's a whole series of halfway houses throughout Orlando. The city just started one in the Paramore area, where they took over an old factory, and now it's like a home where women that have been rescued by police can come and stay for several weeks and get psychological help. And as I said, there are various churches. My wife's church at Winter Park United Methodist is very big. They call the Restoration Circle, and they sponsor a woman who runs like a halfway house in which people can get back on their feet. But if you want to be involved in that, if you just wanted to do something lower key, one of the big things that many churches have done is put together a backpack drive. You get these, a lot of the victims live on the streets, and you would collect, you or organizations, churches with you, such things as shampoos and hairbrushes and cards for bus passes, because it's a hard life, and runaway children within 48 hours, something like half of them have been approached by traffickers, and so it's a way to try to give people some dignity. One of the things that my church throws in, people kind of laugh all the time, but it's these little teddy bears or stuffed animals. You might say, well, how does that fit in with, with all the toiletries? Well, it's because it gives them something to hope, to squeeze, as it were, to get some level of comfort. So there's no hard and fast rules what could go in, but just to give you a sense. And then also, in terms of the labor trafficking, up the road, not far from here in Apopka, there's a big migrant farm worker community, and there's a book that I read written several years ago by a woman named Dale Slongwhite about the whole. It's called Fed Up. It's about the whole, sorry saga of the. It was primarily African-American community from 50 years, from after World War I, when the German prisoners of war were sent there to grow crops for the, through all the, pollution at Lake Apopka. That's where it came from. And these individuals were basically trafficked, is what it amounts to, and held in just deplorable conditions. And now it's primarily Spanish workers, but it's not like they're in chains or whatever anymore, but they come in on visas and they can't work anywhere, and they're exploited oftentimes by, the farmers, and it's the laws aren't as strict as they could be in Florida. So you've got a couple of things. There's a drive that goes on every Lent through some of the churches in Orlando called the Long Sleeve Relief Drive, where you basically give them old shirts, and it protects them from these terrible chemicals that they're exposed to in harvesting, the tomatoes and crops. And then also there's a woman up there. The headquarters for the Farm Workers Association is right up the road here before you get to Apopka, and a woman by the name of Jeannie Economos runs these toxic tours of Lake Apopka, in which church groups, if you get a van together, whatever, you can see. So, things like this, it's the way the situation's evolved, and it's a good outreach, and just wanted to share some of those ideas with you. So rather than grinding everyone down with, there's tons of information here, but I think you get the general idea on what's happening. I was going to close with one of the more insidious ways of the way sex trafficking is coming out in our society today, and it involves the use of websites, social media, cell phones, and believe me, this cuts across all socioeconomic levels, and it's a lot of times the victims kind of go inadvertently looking for trouble themselves. I wanted to leave you with a sense of some of the do's and don'ts, because that, in our modern technology areas, is what it's coming through. And let's watch this first brief treatment of this. It's probably not a great surprise for you to hear me say this, but this is the modern version of trafficking.
You forget? You know I'm sneaking out. It's 9 o'clock the party. 9:15. No.
I heard it was 2 minutes.
Hey, check this out. Yo, what up?
Whoa! Oh man! Yo, send that to me real quick. I'm not gonna. Come on, send that to me.
Man, you a pimp.
Yo, you
are full screen. Look at that, boys. Check that out, boys. I had to send this to Mark. Send that out now.
Well, that regrettably is a pretty accurate snapshot of the society we live in these days, and what that all leads to. And in a broader sense, that's just, among high school guys and this and that. But the whole use of social media is tied into this human trafficking, and in terms of you don't know who you're talking to, and parents don't know who's talking to. So let's go 2 more slides forward, and we'll, I think, end with that. I wanted to, I think I've hopefully haven't worn you out with distressing slides, but wanted to leave you again with a sense in the back, and we can get certainly more of these things. There's certain handouts, and this one is a parent's guide to harmful social media, protect your children. And you've heard of, the Snapchat business, where pictures are sent by young people, and it supposedly disappears in 10 seconds. Well, that's not the whole story. And through various things such as Instagram and Kick Messenger, these are things in which oftentimes are hidden from parents, and there's some information below about helping monitor your children for their own ultimate good. And then we've got what are the signs of human trafficking of a child. It shows here risk signs of when a child is at risk from, some of these could apply to other things, granted, but things such as, being bullied or declining grades, to victim signs. It says now the child is a victim, and you don't know it unless you recognize these signs: excessive cash, lying about ages, fake ID, branding, new jewelry, tattoos, things like that. And again, this number here, you've got both the national hotline you can call anonymously, and then you've also got the Florida Department of Children and Families has a number on that. How can I help end human trafficking? Some of the things we've talked about today. How do I report it? What can I do? And then finally, taking action to get human trafficking. Be a conscientious consumer. I've told you some of those items today. Get the word out among family and friends. You as a local church group could do letter writing parties to Congress people, or in Florida, for example, the hotel industry, and it was just on the front page of the Sentinel Friday about how nationwide a lot of the sex trafficking ends up in known hotel chains, and nationwide the overall group is Trade Society is buying into big training, like Mayor trained 600,000 of their front office and front desk people to do this. But here in Florida, we've got kind of some pushback from the industry, so it's kind of not as far along. Again, you can pray for the victims of trafficking, possibly backpacks, and there's some like websites here too on this Greater Orlando human trafficking. I've been doing this 5 years now, and believe me, there's no end of the distressful things you can hear about. But ultimately, doesn't it come down to what can we all as a community band together to do? So I hope I've given you at least some information that would be useful in terms of a response. And again, if there's a particular threat and it's immediate, 911, or if it's not immediate, you just have concerns, the trafficking number, and certainly any. One last thing you might do is you might appoint some representative here of your congregation to be kind of the trafficking person who would get emails from the Orlando trafficking thing on when things go on before you read about it in the paper, there's a threat. This United Abolitionist group I talked about that does the January thing has about every 2 or 3 months I think it's like $39, an all-day, lunch included thing in which you hear from people from like it's a 6-hour thing down at Calvary Church. You could send some interested folks, perhaps. Some of you might want to go and hear about what's going on, how you can make connections with other community organizations. So just to share some of those with you. And before we open up to questions here, I'll just we opened with a prayer, and if you permit me, I'd like to share with you one of my favorite prayers from St. Francis of Assisi that asks us for inspiration. It goes, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. And thank you all for your kind attention.
I've noticed when someone had those gray containers, is a part of, you ever been approached and they knock on the door to buy stuff in a gray container, and somewhere down the road is a van, and realize that the kids are not receiving the money that they've been promised, and they go door to door. And also they said that they had noticed the van, so what they doing is changing the name and changing the van. But if someone ever come to your door, not take it out in your own hand and go find a van and jack up the people, but walk by and get a picture of the tag number. And also another thing I learned was, this is not with cyberspace, online, social media, but to teach the kids eye contact. Most of the victims doesn't do eye contact, and they can let them know that if they can describe what they look like, they'll be less of a victim. We can teach them, what do they, people, anybody that approach you, what do they look like? Because most of the victims don't do eye contact. Most of the victims don't do eye contact. That's it.
Absolutely. Can't really add a word to that. You've hit the high. Thank you, ma'am. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to share? Is there perchance, in a just a anonymous sense, any immediate problem in the area you're aware of?
I just wanted to share that I think that it's important that we talk about this, because Orlando is number 3 in the country for human trafficking, and the largest population is children, as you've shared with us today. But I don't think that people understand how close it is to us. It's not around us. We talk about all of the indigenous people that are being trafficked, but it's happening number 3 in the country right here. And our children are being approached. They are being approached and don't even know that they're being approached. And we don't think that it's happening in our community, but it is. So thank you for coming.
You're welcome. And I just append to that. Why is Orlando 3? We don't have, we who live here aren't worse than anywhere else, but it's primarily because of the the attractions and the big amount of things. And I grew up in Atlanta, and I think that's actually number 1. And it's with the airport and the conventions. And you read, not a month goes by you don't read in the paper about it's usually out of town, sometimes out of country type people, and their enablers are here because of the big money attraction. But that is it. Yes, ma'am.
On one of the presentation, they said that the victim, when the police officer was talking, he said that the victim keeping records. How can they keep records? That's my question, is how can they, because of the fear that is within them, and then they know that, they're the one that they're working for is on them, and so my question is, how can they keep records of their the clients that are
Well, there's, these handlers, I guess, in terms of your question on keeping records. I guess that went by me. Who was it, like the pimp that was keeping the records on them?
No, one of the police, they said one of the hardest ways where they are not able to prosecute people is because the victims, keeping records of it, but they're young. How can they keep records? They're going through the process so fast. Right.
Well, and a good point. And I would just add that until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, children, teenagers who were caught were charged as prostitutes. And sometimes they were made to shoplift and all. But now the law has been changed nationwide, and any child that is commercially trafficked for sex is considered to be a victim of human trafficking and cannot be prosecuted themselves. So that's a cold comfort, but it is a movement forward in society where, I mean, you've still got, you know, normal prostitutes who sometimes are trafficked, sometimes they're in it because they want to be, but we're talking about here when there's force, and for children, it's always assumed there's going to be force. Does anyone else care to share?
Yes. Well, I have a statement and then a question from another young lady.
Sure.
I just like to say that this pointed out to me the importance of making sure our children know who they are, and know who they belong to, and to make sure that their mindsets are in a great place where they can't be approached and easily get taken. My thing is, that's what keeps playing in my head. I'm like, that could have been me at that age, in that mindset that I had then. So it's important for us to make sure our kids know who they are up here, because then can't nobody take them. Can't nobody just manipulate you into something if your mind is right. So my heart is now on fire to make sure our kids know who they are. And the question from Sister Ingram is, I guess, about males, and how does it affect males as well?
Yeah, nationwide, it's like, I think it's close to 30% of victims in terms of children under 18 are males, and primarily I've read that those are in the big cities, like New York in particular is notorious of the trade. And actually, you know, granted, most of the Johns, or those who are taking advantage of the children for money, are males, but something like 30% of them are actually women, which is always surprises people. So it's kind of cuts across, but very, very good point there on that. Anyone else?
To answer your question about records, one of the things that we tell ladies to do, or teenagers, is the text messages. Like your phone log, those records, those calls, those text messages, the sexting, the picture sending. Those are all things that can be used as records. And in response to what you said, the conversation has to be had. There are lots, when we think about the safety of our children, we think about keeping them with us and protecting them from these things, but we invite people into our house with the internet. They're exposed to way more than we were ever exposed to, and we're not having these harsh conversations. They are exposed to, like children are exposing children. Women are exposing young women, and it should be the opposite. So we protect them by having the conversation. There's a lot of taboo things that we don't talk about. Sex, mental health, domestic violence, all of that stuff has to be talked about, and people have to be educated, and that's how you know who you are, because you know what your danger and your strangers' situations are. It's by having the hard conversations. So.
And one thing I neglected to share, but I think you might want to hear this. This comes from the Florida Attorney General's office, and some recommendations, tips for parents, and about the online thing. And some of the things they say is restrict use of a computer to the living room or other areas where the parent can, see what's going on. And then also, know your children's screen names and passwords. And look, if this is going to be a big fight, you put it in a sealed envelope. And heaven forbid if something happens to them, you can then open that envelope and see their passwords and screen names and see who they've been communicating with. So that's something. And for you young people here, you probably get the idea of some of this thing. Never agree to meet with somebody online that you don't know who they are. And do tell an adult immediately if someone tries to entice you into a meeting or sending, those pictures, particularly you younger women, those Snapchats and all those things they end up forever. So think about that and don't fall into that first step. Do you have something, ma'am?
So I want to say, encourage your children to talk have that open dialect communication within your homes. Example I can give you is, y'all know I live in Georgia, and my family is here, and my son Sean, if he feel like I did something wrong to him, I tell him, you call Nana and you tell her. Because if he's telling on me, he gonna tell on the people on the outside.
Yes, ma'am.
It's not a question, but one of the things with parents too, sometimes we take it so lightly with our kids. We give them the cell phones and all the rights and privilege to that cell phone, but we don't, as parents, do not monitor that. And it is so important for us as parents to monitor our children's phone and not, you know, you do it spontaneously. The kids don't know when it's going to happen. And we need to, as parents, to be more abreast and more educated too with the phone. So we're able to do, because the kids are so well advanced and know how to hide things on those phones too. But we need to monitor our children's phone. And then restrictions, putting restrictions on their phones. Some companies you're able to put restriction on those phones and not allow them to go onto different sites and different areas. So we as parents too have to take on that responsibility too, to safeguard our children.
That's very true. And some ideas, I think they're like half a dozen actual security services and monitoring on the handouts there that for your consideration.
Excuse me. There was a documentary on 2020 some time ago, and some parents made a big stink about it. But what happened was the young lady, they did quite a few different things, and the young lady, teenager, and it was one of the news anchor man and everything, and the parents was in a van. But the girl came out, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and the girl came out the door, got in the van, and the parents, because she didn't see anybody from the back end, and they put a pillowcase over her head. And she's kicking and screaming, blah, 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 blah. And when they pull the pillowcase off, she looks around and she saw her parents. And the parents said, what are you doing? Why are you doing this, and that? And it went into another young lady. She calls, the father was standing behind the news anchor guy. And he speaks, we'll use the word, are you Sally? Yes. Sally had a half-mistress shirt on. She's all dressed up looking like an older young lady. And before the father could say, Sally, he grabbed her and shook her like, what are you doing? What are you doing? This is 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, there was a lot of flack behind the back end of that. Parents would say, how dare you, 2020? How dare you, parents? You invading the child's privacy. Seriously, they made a big flack about that. Oh, you traumatized the child. You could have did it better. And I could, if it just behooved me. It behooved me. And you're talking about this trafficking, but you're giving your child the open door to make decisions like a grown person, you know? And I couldn't believe the outcome of parenting. It just like, wow. And the father was belligerent, like 2 o'clock in the morning. She's creeping outside the door. And the parent was more shocked than anything, because she says, I taught my child. I educate my child. I sit down and talk to my child. And what did the child do?
Well, yeah, and I've read that children's brains and decision-making aren't fully formed till like age 22 or something. And, you know, try to get your 20-year-old to do that. But you know, maybe 16 to 18, you do have more leverage. So bless you for whatever you can on that. Thanks for sharing.
I want to share one last thing.
Yes, ma'am.
I saw a video, I'm not sure if you have it, how we should be aware of our surroundings. Because on the movie that I saw at Aspire, you go on about your day, but being aware of your surroundings. When we viewed the movie, a kid was being kidnapped in the van, and what I'm saying is for us adults to be aware of our surroundings, because we go about our day, we minding our own business, but it's actually happening around us, but we're not aware. I'm just saying be aware of our surroundings, because it's going on, it's prevalent.
Right, needs to start at home, right?
One last comment I wanted to make, and I wanted to bring it home because about 20 years ago here in this ministry, we had someone to come here and as a minister, and then we saw some things that, different signs, different things, and saw ladies that was surrounded with this man, and we can't, it's not trafficking, but this man was pimping these women, but he was a minister. So we have to be aware in our own household, in the church. It happens all in the ministry that you see that. And through it all, one of our young girls, with one of the family members of that one, was even end up with one of them. But we just need to be very careful in all our surrounding that is around us, and that's. It is so important that it starts in our household. It starts here. It starts in our homes, that we need to really bring it forth. And some things we take it as parents, take it lightly, but it is such a important matter. But until it happens into our household, when it becomes an important matter, but it needs to start now to prevent it from happening into your home.
You're here. Amen. Well, thank you all.